Thank you all for joining us on day 2 of the HLEP Symposium, Ongoing Revolutions in Healthcare. We're so excited to have all of you join in person as well as over Zoom. And a huge thanks to Sean and Bobby for really bringing this symposium together, as well as Ben Ho, former HLEP president, as well as Tim Elrick from the Gunderson team, really helping us create a vision and plan for this symposium. There's a sign-in sheet that will be going around for you guys to put your names down. We're having a spring social at Whitney's this Thursday from 7:30 to 9:30 p.m. And you guys will be able to receive a free drink ticket for each panel that you guys attend. Also, HLEP board applications are open and it's not limited to current members if you guys are interested. Lastly, I just want to say thank you to Bobby Graff, who will be moderating today's panel. Bobby is a 1L here at HLS. He's the incoming director of sponsorship for HLEP and founder and host of the Justice Podcast. He's passionate about baking sweet treats as well as writing and performing rhymes. Hopefully he draws some today for us. Thank you. Oh, and I'll let Bobby introduce the panelists.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah, I probably will not be freestyling here today, but we are going to have an awesome panel. Today we are discussing ongoing revolutions in healthcare. That was the title on the calendar event, and you may be wondering what that means. Well, before you have 3 individuals who are facing entrenched powers in the healthcare industry. They are working in ways to really revolutionize and make positive change that's going to benefit millions of people. And so just a quick introduction. From the far end, CL Tian is the CEO and co-founder of PhyX Technologies, an award-winning self-sterilizing materials platform for medtech, healthcare, food, and beyond. And we'll go into what that means later. And medtech leaders engage PhyX to implement a safer, time cost savings, latency-reducing, gentle alternative to traditional terminal sterilization methods, including ETO, gamma, and E-beam. PhyX's numerous industry recognitions include the Global Champion of MedTech Innovator 2022, which last year there were over 1,000 companies competing, and PhyX came out as number 1. Next, we have Vince Lewowski. He's a business lawyer, problem solver, and deal maker. And his clients run from individual investors to entrepreneurs to large corporations that are international. He's Harris Bricken's managing partner out in Oregon, and he has won accolades from Super Lawyers and Chambers USA. He's been hired by the Oregon State Bar and private parties as an expert witness in several cannabis-related business disputes, and also runs Harris Bricken's award-winning Canna Law Blog and Psychedelics Law Blog. Joe Agarwal is the founder and CEO of WISA, a global leader in conversational AI for behavioral health. WISA has helped improve mental health for over 5 million individuals through 500 million conversations across 90 countries, and has received the AI Award from the National Health Service in the UK and the Breakthrough Device designation from the FDA in the USA. Pretty impressive. So we've got a diverse group of people here, and the way that we're going to have this conversation today is we're going to walk through 3 different ways that they have faced challenges, and that is regulation, kind of what we talk about here in law school, rivals or competition, different people working in these same spaces and industries, and then reframing the public perception. Because we know that people may have certain opinions about AI and mental health or around sterilization and sanitation, and certainly psychedelics may be a contentious issue for some individuals. So we know that reframing the public perception is an important aspect of making progress in these spaces. So to start, CL, I know there's actually, we didn't mention it in your bio, but there's a litigation or lawsuit aspect that's affecting your business. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak. And, for our business, part of the thesis for why we got started as a business has very much to do with the legal environment in the US. So if you think about the last time that you or a loved one or a friend had to get surgery, you probably want that, tools that they're using to be sterile. And that happens using a colorless gas called ethylene oxide. Turns out this causes cancer in the communities where it's used. And this is something that the industry has been using for decades. And the only reason there's a push to switch is because the EPA is cracking down and because law firms, seeing the opportunity and also I think doing the right thing here, are suing these companies. So they had this is something that we saw at the beginning of 2020. Everyone thought we were crazy to start the business. It was April 2020 when we launched it. First of all, what the heck are you doing? It's a pandemic. And then second of all, no one changes how you make things. Sure, you can make something new, but changing how you make billions and billions of devices, that's something else. And fast forward, about a quarter of the entire industry for sterilization of medical devices is under high cancer risk in the US. And the first lawsuit to go to trial in September was the sterilizer lost and had punitive damages for one person, single plaintiff, $363 million. And so, that lawsuits are really driving the need. There's been a much larger need for a longer time because, of course, we want, as an industry, making life-saving devices to also be responsible in the communities where we're making them. But I think the unique environment in the US makes it that we have a really spectacular business opportunity as well as an opportunity to do the right thing.
Joe, when you hear someone a company getting sued and having to pay out $363 million because they didn't comply with regulation or they weren't treating their employees well, does something like that stress you out? Not because you're doing anything wrong, but these regulations are complicated, and certainly AI is under a lot of scrutiny right now. How does something like that make you feel, and how do you face regulations when you're thinking about your business?
It's a great question. When we started 7 years ago, going into AI and mental health, even if you're a social enterprise, even if you're trying to solve a big global problem, you have to walk in imagining that someone sometime is going to sue you. Because there are people who are going to need help, and like anybody who goes into medical practice knows that they will get sued sometime. But you don't have that kind of liability insurance for AI that you do for a medical practice. So what can you do? And so even before we went live with our first customer, we had worked with lawyers to figure out what it is that we can do to make sure that we can still try to solve, like fools rush in where angels fear to tread, but protect ourselves from both personal and corporate liability. And really it comes down to this, to say that yes, you will potentially have a time when AI fails and is inappropriate in its response, and that will happen probably 20% of the time that someone talks to even our conversational AI. But you have to have put in measures to make sure, both from an ethical and legal perspective, that you have done everything possible to prevent that from being triggering to somebody. So it's really about being able to demonstrate that you have gone that extra mile and you've done whatever is the industry standard and beyond if that's possible. And you've pushed it to the extent. So we scoured the world and said, from a clinical safety perspective, who has standards? And we had to find ancillary standards that only the NHS at that time had, which is called the DCBO 129 on clinical safety. So we said, okay, across the world, the most robust standard in this is in the NHS in the UK. So why don't we go take that standard, adapt it to AI, then engage with the top advisors on AI ethics, and then say, we're going to do it like this, what do you guys think? And then document our clinical hazards and put out those logs. And similarly, on a privacy standpoint, we said, how can we make sure that there is just no chance that anybody's data will ever get into the hands of somebody, and that means that we don't know who they are. let alone, if we don't know who they are and our server never stores anything even inadvertently shared on personally identified data, then we're safe. And that stood us in good stead last year when Mozilla Foundation did an expose on all the mental health apps. And Forbes and Fortune and everybody was covering these articles about how Talkspace and Calm are breaching privacy. And then the footnote in those articles was, the best of privacy is wiser. And even though they're AI, they've somehow got it right. So because you know that you will get sued someday, you sort of go that extra mile. And that then stands you in good stead even when you're pitching to customers.
That's great. And Vince, you're in a little bit of a different spot. So one way that we could think about regulation in the cannabis or psychedelics industry is maybe through a metaphor, and forgive me if this is too corny, but the idea of psychedelics sometimes by proponents says, they say that, well, psychedelics don't actually add anything to your brain, they just unlock what's already there. They allow you to access something in your mind or something in your being that you already have some sort of natural instinct to do, and that can be helpful in therapeutic senses, certainly for mental health. But I want to take that thought of unlocking what's already there and apply it to the regulatory space and ask this. Is it as simple as flipping a switch and saying, okay, yeah, sure, cannabis legal, psychedelics legal, because what exists is already good enough? Or do we need to think about this differently and establish a new type of regulation?
Yeah, good question. So can you guys hear me all right? Okay. Thanks again for having me. I think there's a lot of debate and different opinions about what you just asked. Should we create some sort of new paradigm of regulation for cannabis, say? And you see a lot of the chatter up at like the congressional level with what they're doing with acts like the MORE Act. It's something similar to let's regulate this a lot like alcohol. Let's deschedule it entirely federally and let's sort of leave it to the states to have their own programs. And with that one, they're going to have a federal permitting scheme, but that's sort of one model for it. And then other people say, well, that's not a good model at all. And this is a very different kind of substance. It's got different sort of public health concerns around it. We ought to take a different approach. And sometimes that approach is as simple as just broadly decriminalize it and just leave it all alone. So I don't know. There are all sorts of different efforts and agendas and discussions around that. I don't know what's going to happen. Right now, we have this odd sort of dualist system, both for cannabis and now psychedelics, where these are still Schedule I drugs at the federal level, which means that, under the federal government's read, or under Congress's read and the DEA's read, there's sort of no safe use for these drugs at all, and they're heavily criminalized, and they're less safe than Schedule II drugs like opiates and cocaine and all these things. That seems strange to a lot of people when you sort of look around at what's happening, in the various states and all of these sales that are going on. But states are kind of doing what they're allowed to do under the 10th Amendment, which is rolling out these programs. There's no preemption under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, and it's just a situation where the federal government's choosing not to enforce its federal laws and come in there and shutter these businesses. So what's going to happen? I don't really know. From a commercial perspective, it's also very interesting. What we're seeing right now with psychedelics, for example, is sort of a dual track system where you see all sorts of drugs in the FDA pipeline, right? And the drugs are pretty far along. Like Compass Pathways is a big company, and they're now moving into phase 3 FDA trials for a psilocybin drug. We're going to have an MDMA drug here approved next year by FDA. That's a Schedule I. People debate whether MDMA is a psychedelic, but so you have this sort of dual track system where you're going to have a pharma program on the one hand, and then you're going to have states with these funky little licensing programs like what Oregon has and Colorado's going to have on the other. And you may just have a dualist sort of system where you go to a doctor and you get a prescription for a certain condition and you have a treatment regime associated with a psychedelic drug that's FDA approved, or you just ignore all that and you go to your state licensed service center or whatever it is and do some sort of psychedelic facilitation there under supervision, and it's not FDA approved. So there are a million ways this stuff could go. There are a million sort of different ideas about how it should go, and I think I would just leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Joe, back to you. We want to shift the conversation to rivals and competition. Obviously, it's great that you're bringing in another tool for the mental health crisis that exists really globally, certainly post-pandemic, but even before that. How are you thinking about competition? When we think of, in a business aspect, there's the Porter's five forces, right? And there's the entrenched powers, there's the new company coming in, and then there's always the risk of somebody else coming in and trying to take your spot. Of course, we're thinking about the patients, but this is also a business, so there's a little bit of competing involved. What is your take on the best way to approach that problem?
The competition really differs from what you're competing for. So if you're competing for a slice of the budget, or you're competing for the user's attention, for instance, in terms of coping mechanisms in mental health, Netflix and YouTube are competition because they're on their phone and they could either go to Visa and have a conversation about their mental health, or they could just avoid their issue and just go on to, watch a series or something. And many people choose to do that. And how do you actually bring them in? And so that's competition from mind share of the user at the time when you want to build those positive coping mechanisms. That's tough competition to beat. On the other hand, on a share of budget, we end up being a new category because you can't really replace, for instance, an employee assistance program that a large employer might have, or a therapist that a healthcare provider would have a network of therapists that they send people to. So what you're trying to do is supplement that and say, you don't have enough therapists, or your employees are not being supported with this EAP, they're not taking it up. Let's actually try to solve the problem. And to me, in that, my biggest competition, or the biggest reason why we don't succeed, in spite of sort of having the data to show how we will solve the problem for you of employee mental health or your patient mental health or even your clinical outcomes, better than anything else that's out there, is that there are not enough people actually trying to solve the problem. That lots of people are trying to make their bonus and fit into their KPIs and figure out how their companies can make more money. But at a broader level, when you're a social enterprise, there are not many people out there in the healthcare systems or even in the employer setup who are just like, we have people who are not feeling okay, we need to make them feel okay. It's very much, I have an EAP, I don't have take-up of it, but I need another EAP, so where do I get the budgets from? And that, to me, that mindset is competition. It's like I have a mindset to say, we want to solve global mental health, and I'm competing with those who don't have that mindset. The moment I find somebody with that mindset, it's an easy sale.
Very well put. CL, over to you. Regarding competition, obviously there's very entrenched powers, as you've discussed, but there may be some wiggle room now, or there's a gap you can fill because of this litigation. How might you leverage that environment in order to promote FIEX?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the whole reason that we started the company almost 3 years ago in the first place was, one of the premises for the company was, it's only going to be a matter of time that law firms are going to get on this and threaten the profits of these large medical device companies. And by shutting down these key facilities that are required as part of the supply chain, and that's going to happen sometime in the next few years, and we're going to be well positioned. That's really accelerated. No one really could have expected that in 2022, 25% of the industry is high cancer risk. EPA sends out, under the Clean Air Act, a notification to each community where there's a risk, and they draw a nice little heat map for personal injury firms to then target people in those communities with Facebook ads, social media, right? So that is all happening in the background. And we've really experienced the offshoot of that sort of the tailwinds for our company. It took us about 15 months to get to our first customer, but we organically grew 3x last year, which is highly unusual in terms of top-line revenue for a medical device company. And right now, over half of our customers are publicly traded medical device leaders. We're within shooting distance of commercial use. And so for us, yes, we see the biggest competition as the entrenched status quo, right? Could these companies take this technology and say, hey, we're big enough, this plant might close down, but we're going to go somewhere else. Or, that plant might close down, but we're going to nearshore in Mexico. But frankly speaking, I don't know about the optics of that, right? To move away from using a cancer-causing technology in the US, and then instead, as a healthcare company, move it to a country that, it's less regulated. I don't know about the optics of that, right? But for our customers, what they see when they're looking at our technology is, okay, instead of sending it out to a third-party chamber, we're going to be able to sterilize where and when we make these devices with packaging materials, so there's no technology required. At the amount of devices that are currently exposed to this market issue, this regulatory issue, is 20 billion a year in the US. That's a lot of devices. There's a lot of space for multiple players to solve this. We think we're well positioned to solve the majority of this problem, but quite frankly, I have real concerns about our industry's ability to keep supplying life-saving devices because regulation is causing a faster shutdown rate than industry is able to adopt something. So we've been really fortunate and well supported by the industry. I think that's highly unusual. But again, this is also highly unusual when the mixture of EPA regulation and lawsuits takes down a critical technology that's been used for decades.
And CL, just as a quick follow-up, if you could explain just roughly what the technology of Phi-X is.
Yeah, sure. That's a frequent question we get because there's a lot to unpack here, right? So instead of, think about a catheter, right? If you're having some sort of surgery and they put a catheter in you, currently when they make that, they'll package it, and they'll send it off to a plant, put it into a gas chamber, gas it, now it's sterile, and it can go to the hospital. Medical device companies are responsible for that. They do it with third-party vendors. Where we come in is we have a packaging material that's light activated. And when it's activated by light, it releases a sterilant that, first of all, is safe. It's been in use in multiple forms in the US for about 100 years. Drinking water, produce, vegetation, meats, mouthwash. And then it releases that sterilant into the package instead of using a large piece of machinery to do this. And so the offshoot of that is now you can sterilize with your packaging, and it's very much more efficient, and it's actually more profitable for these companies.
Thanks, CL. Vince, I know we talked about regulations already, and we're talking about rivals, but some might think that the regulations are the rivals.
Yeah.
Can you discuss a little bit of how you've written in your blogs and even done other work to push the project forward of actually allowing cannabis and psychedelics to be used?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'll answer in a couple different ways. First of all, if you guys get into an area of law where you interface with regulators a lot, it's kind of important to cultivate and develop those relationships because in a sense they're your rivals. They're always kind of telling you and your clients what you can and can't do, but in a sense they can be extremely helpful. And if you cultivate good relationships with regulators, you'll often be able to access information that is really beneficial to you and your clients in ways that you can't access if you're just kind of sitting and watching and observing. But I do think of regulators as rivals sometimes. I always tell them, like, notwithstanding that we have a pretty good relationship, sometimes I have to sue you. And I think, everybody gets it. It's funny, but that's really how it is. We push them pretty hard. I've always pushed them hard, and they ask us to come sit on rulemaking committees sometimes, and that's a good thing. And we disagree about how things should be done sometimes, but if you're vocal enough for long enough, sometimes you get seats at tables you wouldn't have, otherwise been invited to. I've been privileged to advise our local, congressman, Earl Blumenauer, who goes and advocates for a lot of the federal legislation. Eventually, we got invited to represent the federal government on some banking issues when the hemp bill passed, with respect to how, the Bank Secrecy Act should be interpreted with respect to hemp or marijuana. So I think by being vocal and kind of getting out there and not accepting everything a regulator tells you, but also treating them kind of reasonably and sort of understanding like their perspective, but advocating for your client, you can get a long way. So yeah, regulators can be thought of as rivals. The classic answer for who your rival is as a law firm is obviously sometimes other lawyers. And that's it, in the cannabis industry, in any new space, sometimes it's actually helpful to have rivals, I think, and other people come into the space. When I was pretty early in my career and stepped out and started doing this kind of stuff, not a lot of lawyers were doing it. Most were not willing to do it. There was a question under Ethics Rule 1.2 whether lawyers were even allowed to consult with businesses that were violating the Federal Controlled Substances Act. It just reads that you cannot advise anybody that's in violation of law. Well, what does that mean when they're trying to comport with state laws? And I took the position that what we could do was okay, and a lot of the state bars have since looked at that, and a lot of the ethics rules have since been amended in the way that I had read them, which is good, but if you didn't, so there's some sort of risk there. But I guess what I'm trying to answer in a roundabout way with respect to rivals is I really appreciated when more lawyers and more law firms came into the space, because in the early days it was hard doing business lawyering because you were up against either A, no lawyer, which is always a mess, or B, some criminal defense lawyer who was trying to work on this businessy stuff, which, I mean, they're smart people and all, but God help you if I have to go represent you in, say, drug court, right? I just don't know what I'm doing. So when the level comes up and you have rivals or people that are, able to sort of interface with you at your level, sometimes that can be a good thing for you and for your clients and for everybody. So I guess I answered that question in two ways, and I appreciated Joe's answer and CL's answer about how your rivals don't necessarily have to be somebody that's directly across the V from you, but in your case it can be like a Netflix or anything else that distracts from attention from a service you're trying to provide. So appreciate the question. Those are my answers.
Could I just add to that?
Oh, please. Yeah.
So actually, I really appreciate what you said, because in AI for mental health, conversational AI for mental health, there are really two companies, Visa and Wobot. And Wobot, being that other company to come in, actually created an industry. Until then, we were the crazy ones trying to do something. Now there's another startup out of Stanford. It's backed by Andrew Nunn, so you've got, credibility around it. Now when somebody writes an article, it isn't, one crazy person doing it. It's an industry.
Yeah. Strength in numbers.
Strength in numbers makes a lot of sense. So finally, we want to shift into reframing the public perception. We've addressed it indirectly up till now, but let's take it head on at this point. Joe, AI is contentious. Everybody knows that it's running in the background of a lot of different apps and other things that we're using in life. But even in recent congressional hearings, there's a lot of scrutiny on what's going on, where's the data going, who's using this, and then of course there's even individuals who wonder, do I want to be interacting with a robot, or the robot's going to take over the world? What's going on? Can you explain how you message that this is going to be a productive thing and kind of stay some of the fears people might have?
I might take all of my 5 minutes. I'll take the question at multiple levels. So first of all, with ChatGPT, there is a hype cycle. So that hype cycle, I think all of you have seen, where it's like, oh my God, I was at Davos this year, speaking on mental health, but all anybody wanted to talk to me about was, is AI going to have my job? And then by February end, they were just like, and we're anybody who wants, we've got a white paper on how to actually use AI for healthcare with conversational AI and how to put the guardrails. But by February end, it seemed like, writing that white paper was a non-issue because New York Times had written an article that said that it started becoming a stalker, so nobody wanted to talk about it. Then ChatGPT 4 comes out, and everybody's, again, just before our white paper comes out, everybody's talking about it again in the conference I was in last year. So public perception is a really fickle thing. And before ChatGPT, the last experience public had of conversational agents were the kinds that did customer support. They were really multiple choice IVRs, so we would never say we were a chatbot because just the expectation of what you're going to get is so low that you don't even try it. So after ChatGPT, everybody is expecting it to, do I don't know what. So that perception also you have to manage. So that's the context within which you're interacting with the user, you're interacting with an environment. Then healthcare per se, you still have people who are not going to click on an email. They're just struggling to get their doctors to even begin to use basic technology or go on a Zoom session. So how do you even get them to realize that AI is something that can help them? Within all that noise and all that hype cycle, what really works for us is research. So the way we manage that for environments who are either in a hype cycle or in complete skepticism of what AI can do is by showing them research by the VA that says people are much more likely to engage with an AI therapist than a human therapist. And that efficacy on an AI therapist matches or can be better than a human therapist. That you have a therapeutic alliance as measured independently by this data from millions of people that is built faster than a human therapist. So you start going in with data, and it takes work on the other person's side to change their mindset. And that's why that little box for me that I have found where all of this works is if somebody has a problem to solve. So at a user level, if somebody's actually feeling depressed or anxious or needs help, they will get over the weirdness of talking to AI, and it's up to us in the first session. 85% of the people say they were helped in their first session alone. So it's up to us to deliver that help, and it's up to them to actually get over the weirdness of talking to AI. And it works. And from that point, perceptions change. But even in an organizational context, you need people who actually want to solve a problem. Then they make the effort to read your data, to read your research. If somebody's just there to sort of, shoot the breeze, then they don't really have a problem to solve, then they can hold on to their perceptions forever.
Yeah. When you're talking about, certain medical providers using old school technology, I remember receiving awesome physical therapy care from my provider. And then as I was leaving the office, I heard this old school 90s internet noise. It's because they had a fax machine in the back. This doesn't make sense to me. But
the IRS still makes us fax and things sometimes. It's terrible.
It's awful.
Yeah.
Go on a whole rant on old school government technology. But CL, you're interacting with some of these medical providers who still have fax machines in their offices, maybe just resistant to change. How do you reframe their perception when they're maybe a little bit hesitant to take a risk?
Yeah. So, for us, when our end customer is the makers of the medical device, right? So not necessarily the hospital, but if you look up, top 100 medical device companies, those are the companies coming to us to work with us. Like I tell people, it took us 15 months to land our first customer. And then shortly after that, we've spoken to over 100 companies that have reached out to us, including some of the largest. And so part of what we've always done is we've had a maniacal focus on helping the customer win. And there's some companies in the space that have taken the position that you are going to pry the use of this cancer-causing gas out of our hands, and the public just needs to get over it. Now, I don't know about you, but that was the position that our kind of industry trade group had taken early on, right? we can use dangerous chemicals safely, it's not that bad, the linkage to cancer is akin to kind of other environmental factors, and so because this is a critical technology, we can't really do without it, right? I was raised by 2 chemists, and so that means that there was all sorts of odd chemicals around the house because my parents thought it was better to make it themselves rather than pay the margin to buy it from the store, right? So I can appreciate that there's a way that we can work and live around dangerous chemicals. We have to, right? Chemicals are important. They're critical to everything we do. That said, I don't think the industry, clearly based off of the success of these lawsuits and what's happening, has been responsible, right? So, the farm animals are already out the gate at this point. And, to your point, there are companies that are, there's a great book called Crossing the Chasm about getting market adoption, right? You have your early adopters, your innovators, you have your early majority, your late majority, and you have your laggards kind of on a bell curve that adopts maybe never, right? And so for us, we are just focused. The companies that want to make the shift right now, let's help them be successful. They are the champions. We just see ourselves as an enabling company. The accolades are great. We appreciate that, all the recognition. It helps the business. But frankly, this industry has a major crisis to solve, and it's our honor to be part of the solution. So we don't try and convince anyone that needs to be convinced, so to speak. I think when I look at the companies out there, the ones that implement us first are going to have a major profit advantage that will show on their stock price later on. And so how it works in our industry is once you have a couple of people adopting use of a new technology, everyone follows. So that's what we expected at the beginning, and we've seen that play out so far.
And Vince, if you could dive in a little bit deeper on the discussion we had earlier about the evolution of the way that you've been messaging this platform. Earlier on, maybe you seemed like the person who was out of their mind, like, okay, what is he doing? And now it's maybe a little bit more common. How has that experience shaped your career and shaped the way that you think about messaging something like this?
I mean, it's good if you step out and it works. Like, luckily, the trend of what I do, cannabis legalization and all of that, worked in my favor, and the industries just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So as sort of a younger lawyer, at the time I started being really vocal about this stuff, I was probably a 4th or 5th year lawyer, and I already got to be something of a thought leader in the space. More so my partner, Hillary, she's really, really made her mark. And it's because she started so early and was sort of willing to talk about that stuff when nobody else would talk about it. And there are risks associated with that. Like, she was drugged before, I think, 1 or 2 ethics tribunals about, just random, like, anonymous complaints. This person's advising cannabis businesses and stuff like that. So you may have to suffer some slings and arrows, but if it works out, you get an opportunity to be a thought leader in a space, and that's kind of a big deal, right? It takes you a lot of places. So I guess that would be the short answer of it. I'm trying to think what else I could even say about it. What sort of information are you thinking about? Or
I guess just how are you identifying your audience, and do you have connections with the people who maybe read your blog or other?
I mean, we started blogging. Legal blogging is kind of a pervasive thing now. We started it sort of early on as a way to get clients, essentially. It turned out to be a really good way to get media and get press, because all sorts of like reporters and people like that find you through that. And it just it's a way for a smaller firm like us to have a bigger platform, I guess is what I would ultimately say. And I don't know, if I were starting now, maybe there's some newer, better way to reach people. But really what we did is try to just get messaging out there quickly to clients. And this was kind of before there were even more direct methods other than emails to get information out there that well. So I don't know. I just think any opportunity you guys get for thought leadership is an opportunity to take. And I feel lucky to have been a right place, right time type of person, and be a little bit brave about it. I guess I was in a nice law firm, a good downtown Portland law firm on the way up, rising associate, all that kind of stuff. But I just didn't like the sort of thrust of the firm, and I didn't feel like it was entrepreneurial enough, and I felt like there was this whole new thing that was about to happen, and it was exciting, and most laws sort of settled, and this kind of law is definitely not settled, and all these people really need good advice and they're not able to get good advice and come on, let's go. And my firm was just kind of, no, they were just, it was committee after committee, write us this memo. Why can we do this? What are the risks? Well, what will our insurance provider think? What will our bank think? What will our, all this stuff. And eventually I just got a little bit tired of it. And I said, I'm going to go do something entrepreneurial. And if it doesn't work out, at least I tried. So if you have opportunities like that, like these women are amazing. My heroes are like the people who have an idea, start it, raise money or not, hopefully not as much, and then treat people well, succeed, and hopefully exit at some point. I think that's about as good as it gets. So I'm trying to do my little version of it in the law, like where you buy into a partnership and run a law firm and do all right. But I just think I'm really happy to hear the kinds of things you guys have to say. I'm very impressed by both of you. Yeah.
So with that, I want you all to start thinking of questions, and you may already have them on your minds, but we're going to run through some rapid fire questions real quickly and then open it up to the audience. So just to shift the gears a little bit, getting to know you on a more personal level. First, favorite childhood snack, Joe?
Chocolate.
Does anybody know what the Schwann's man is, by chance?
The Schwann's man?
Is that just a Midwest thing? So it was this truck that would come around to the neighborhood and
Oh.
You know what this is?
Yeah.
Okay, so they sold like a lot of ice creams, but also like whatever, lasagnas and things you could put in your oven. They sold ice cream sandwiches, and I love those things. And I used to like steal them out of the freezer and walk around the block. I came across them somehow a year ago, and I was so excited to eat one, but it tasted like astronaut food, so it's no longer my favorite, but that was my favorite when I was a kid.
CL?
That's a toughie. I think probably Japanese soft cream.
Oh, yeah.
And because they have different flavors per region, and it's always very fun to like go to different cities and try their specific flavor, whether it's black sesame or orange, because that's their regional specialty. Yeah, highly recommend.
Nuance my answer a little bit.
All right.
Specific chocolate 5-star that you get in India. And when I was a kid, I just thought, if I ever made money, then I'll buy as many of them. And you grow up and life doesn't work out that way.
Sure, you get as much chocolate as you want now?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
The world's
It's a little bit different of a world. Well, with that, let's open it up to audience Q&A. Who has a question?
Yeah, thank you all so much for being here. This was super interesting. Vince, this one's for you. So you said that you spent some time interacting with various regulatory agencies. Is that exclusively kind of on behalf of the individual client you're working with, or do you think of it in kind of a broader sense where if you can get more favorable regulation, that'll increase the number of possible clients because people will start to move towards the space?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, it's intellectually just interesting, right? Like sort of like there's this brand new industry all of a sudden, and how do we regulate it? And it's fun to think and be a part of that process. But then, yeah, secondly, I mean, some of these regulations have really been hard on business and have driven some of these businesses into the ground. And some of these states are a mess. And I really think that to the extent we can like protect industry and push for, it's generally pushing for less regulation essentially. There's this sort of ethos with state regulators with cannabis, and it makes sense. The justification makes sense. They think, well, this is a federally illegal substance. We have to be very careful, and we have to regulate this in an extremely strict way. We have to show the federal government, back when there was this thing called the Cole Memo, that we're aligned with federal enforcement priorities, and this is going to be, there's going to be no leakage, none of this stuff here. So the regulations became pretty onerous, and when you combine that with all kinds of other business realities these businesses face, like oppressive taxation, lack of banking, et cetera, it just becomes really, really hard to operate. So I do think there's a pretty heavy element of like, look, we're just trying to help our clients and protect our client base with respect to pushing for the regulations that we often push for.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
Thank you guys again. This was so interesting. I love everything you guys had to say. So this is kind of for all of you. I was really curious if social media has played any role in your companies. When this discussion moved to the topic of like mind share and mental health, the first thing I thought was like TikTok and how that's really prevalent to, it feels like a younger audience, and exploring like their willingness to try like new products or just like open public awareness. So I was curious how social media if it has.
I can talk to mental health. Of course, it's changed attitudes globally. So there used to be lots of grant funding for awareness campaigns of mental health, and now it's social media. So influencers are talking about it. Meta, for instance, works with their influencers to promote mental health awareness and their own mental health. But social media is also determined to be one of the most adverse inputs to people's mental health because it's a combination of something that personalizes everything, makes everything be about you, and at the same time has the dopamine hit and crash, which is very addictive. So neuroscientifically, you can say that social media is bad for mental health, but it's also promoted awareness and normalized the conversation across the world. TikTok reminds me it's sort of a bit of an interesting way in which I didn't think social media would impact us. One of our biggest hazardous models is detecting suicidality in somebody who talks to us in AI. Mm. And social media creates its own slang. So I want to eat pasta is a TikTok slang for suicidality, which our AI would never detect until you engage with social media and figure out what's the current slang for these things.
So for us, the only social media that we're really on, and this is so lame but effective, is LinkedIn. And so based off of what I've shared, you can imagine that what we're doing is highly technical, highly specific to an industry, right? So we keep the conversation very tight. And part of the conversation as a kind of a growing company is people want to know that you're still around. They want to know you're making progress. And that in the medical device world is you're not going to have like 1,000 more users, and you don't have the same growth that a software company has. You're not going to throw big parties. Some people do, but you're like the whole public show of building the company doesn't really happen. That said, when we were selected by industry as the global champion, we had a lot of medical device companies find us online and say, hey, by the way, we've been watching you for 2 years now. Now we want to do something. We've been watching you for a long time. Now you seem like a legitimate company. There's another piece of this which I've talked about, which is the public health aspect. We're talking about 100 sterilization facilities in the US that use this chemical, about a quarter in high cancer risk. That, you can imagine, would spread like wildfire, right? No one wants to find out, oh my goodness, I've been living within a mile of a plant that is emitting 10 times, 20 times higher. That's reality for people around the US. No one in our industry, ourselves included, are going to stoke that fire. And the reason is you can't cause the shutdown of these plants. It's irresponsible to do that without a solution that's widely implemented, right? Whoever gets there first, I imagine that that's something they'll want to push on to cause more public pressure to further speed up development and adoption of whichever technology. But there is a responsibility that we have as companies to say, hey, we're working on this together as an industry. Is it ideal? Not at all. Would it be worse if suddenly all these plants shut down? For sure.
I have a general question about just like as maybe an emerging or young company, how you approach the idea of like diversification of your offerings or products. I think this plays a lot of role in like pharma. If they have like one key asset that maybe doesn't do well, or there's like a company called Relmada that had that problem. But I just wondering, this might not apply because I think it's clear that you guys have kind of a breadth of offerings, but how you approach the idea of like putting all your eggs in one basket for one product or offering, or kind of trying to diversify to increase your ability to reach different like customers or people in that way. So I was just wondering your mindset, kind of thinking about those issues.
Yeah, I can address that pretty quickly. So we started not with an idea, right? So my first company that I started a couple years out of school when I was 24, 10 years ago, we were doing business development and helping build a commercial pipeline for novel technologies. When my co-founder came to me, he was referred to me as a client in the beginning of 2020 and said, hey, I have this self-sterilizing materials technology. What do you think of it as a COVID containment application? Now, my family being from China, I said, you know what? Don't really want to take on the project because I want to get away from what my parents have done as much as possible. That always boomerangs back, by the way. But if we can make a difference, we'll do that, right? So that was our first premise of what we're going to use the technology for. When COVID started to increase the cases in the US, we brought it back here and I ran my process. What I found, I was so surprised by, because in all my years of doing business development, I'd never experienced this, which is every medical device company we spoke to, and we had spoken to pharma, we spoken to healthcare systems, we spoke to broadly healthcare. And what the medical device company said was, yes, we think that perhaps COVID application, COVID's really impactful right now for sure. That said, we might not be able to make devices in a couple years. Right, so that's how we really honed in on our beachhead market in our first application. We have a broad platform, but that beachhead application is what our investors invest money in the success. So really, it was the market that told us where to start. Yeah.
If I can add to that, when you do get that product market fit, then it's important to focus and reduce resources. When you start out as a company, it is a little bit of let 1,000 flowers bloom, but we have a saying where you say that if you think anything's going to be small, you're either just full of ego or you're just too far away from it, because everything turns, into a lot of work. So how many things that you, for instance, just saying, the same app I'm going to use for chronic pain versus chronic conditions seems like 2 days job of just changing 5 modules, in a little bit and changing the packaging. But then I need different RCT trials, I need a different FDA pathway, I need different marketing teams, and it just balloons into what seems initially as a very tiny shift in product into a distraction. So you have to find product market fit. For that, you need to have an MVP, which might be many, but once you do have that, and it's going to go in, you can't have too many of those.
All right, just as a quick wrap-up question, any advice that you would have for maybe some of these students who might be interested in working in the healthcare industry in the future?
Interesting. So I thought I was going to become a professor, and after a brief stint working for a university, at 24, I decided to start my first business. I had no business background and knew nothing and didn't know how little I knew. Right? So the arrogance of youth, I suppose, but that was a good thing. So I kind of fell into working in healthcare. I was looking to, at that point in my career, was looking for a team to partner with to really scale up some sort of venture scale business. I said I want to develop myself as someone who could run a business and command the flow of capital to use business for a force for good. And so healthcare was kind of, incidental. But what really made a difference was the communities I had networked in.
I'd say you're walking into, especially in the US healthcare, a place which is very frustrating because there's so much that's broken and so much that feels so evident that it should be so simple to fix. Yeah. And it has become so difficult to fix it. And a large part of that is something that you want to do, but then you become a part of the system. So my advice to you would be aim high, figure out what you do want to do in life. At this age, you can sort of say, this is what I want to change, this is the problem statement, and stick to it and keep going back to it and not become a part of the system. And yet another person who says, yeah, I would have, but you know what. Mm-hmm.
I think that's the perfect way to wrap up Revolutions in Healthcare. fight the power, fight the system. Can we give our panelists a hand, please?